Good morning and welcome to Ask the Expert. I'm Joe Taylor. This morning, another in the ongoing series of programs presented by the Regional Early Learning Resource Center. The program, through the Northwest Institute of Research, oversees a grant from the Office of Child Development and Early Learning at the Pennsylvania Department of Human Services and the Department of Education. The goal of the program is to improve the outcomes for young children as they prepare for school. John Posa from the Early Learning Resource Center is the host of the program and is with us throughout the series. Well, good morning, John, and who do we have on the line this morning?
Well, good morning, Joe. This morning I am so pleased to welcome Maxwell King, who is the author of the New York Times best-selling biography, The Good Neighbor, on the life and work of children's TV pioneer Fred Rogers. And Max King has known Fred Rogers for quite some time, worked with him, and he previously served as director of the Fred Rogers Center for Early Learning and Children's Media at Saint Vincent College in Latrobe. Welcome to the program, Mr. King.
Great to be with you.
Yes, finally have you scheduled, and we were so excited to get you to talk about the book. And, because so much has gone on over the past year or so, involving the 50th anniversary of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And first of all, let's just talk about your relationship with Fred and how far back you went with him, and what led you to write the biography.
Sure. Well, I didn't get to Pittsburgh until 1999. I came out here to run a foundation called the Heinz Endowments, which was one of the principal funders of Family Communications, which was Fred's production company.
Right.
And I only met him a couple of times, but one of those times I went to his office for a conversation that lasted about an hour and a half that his staff set up. And I assumed it was a conversation about funding, about the program, about what his plans would be for the program. And it wasn't at all. We just talked for an hour and a half about life, about children, grandchildren, about Pittsburgh. We talked about Nantucket, where his family has a house and my family has a house. And he never mentioned one word about his plans for the program or the question of funding. Of course, he got the grant.
Yeah.
And but it was a wonderful conversation, and it really piqued my interest in Fred as a person, not just as an educator, not just as a innovator on television, but as a remarkable and, to me, exemplary person. And later, when I retired and took a retirement job to try to help Saint Vincent College get the Rogers Center going, start some programs and raise money for them, I raised the issue with Joanne Rogers, Fred's widow, and Archabbot Douglas Nowicki, who's the chancellor of St. Vincent College. Why isn't there a biography of Fred Rogers? I said, this is this really important, iconic cultural figure in America, and there's no biography. And they explained to me that Fred never wanted a biography when he was alive, and they were trying to honor that now or then. And I said, with all due respect, Fred is gone. We're trying to get out there and raise $6 to $8 million to get the center going, and we need a biography. And finally, Joanne turned the tables on me and said, okay, you're right, you do it. And she knew I had a background as a journalist and a writer, and so not fully appreciating how much work it would be, I dug in and started doing it.
Oh, that's fantastic. I'm sure you had a lot of information to draw on through archives, through the center, and so forth, and they were probably of major assistance as you were developing the book, right?
Oh, absolutely. The archive at the Rogers Center at St. Vincent is just a spectacular place, and Fred left most of his professional legacy there. He left the rights to what was then Family Communications. It's now called Fred Rogers Productions. And, of course, they're producing wonderful new television programming at Fred Rogers Productions. And he left the rights to the program there. But all of his documents, his letters, artifacts from the program, records from the program, digitized video of every single one of the 900 episodes. All of this stuff was left to the archives. All his letters are there. The music that he wrote, he wrote 200 songs,
right,
and I think 13 operas, and he wrote them out on paper, so the music is even there, which is wonderful to see the product of his creativity. But the single most important thing they did at the center, and they did this long before I got there, when actually Bill Eisler, who for years was the president of Family Communications,
right, know him,
and spent a couple of years as the director out there, he got this accomplished. They did an oral history project in which they got 63 of the people who worked with Fred or had friendships with Fred or were family with Fred, and they did all these oral histories, video and audio and transcripts, and that was just a gold mine for me. And the archive made them available to me exclusively for the purposes of a biography while I was working on it. And I did my own interviews. I did about 50 interviews, but the oral history material that was developed by the Narrative Trust out of New York was just spectacularly rich.
Right.
With all of the attention given to Fred Rogers recently, including TV shows, movies, of course, your book, what do you feel the takeaway has been about the man, his accomplishments, and his place in our contemporary culture? I guess his legacy, and how will he be remembered 20 years from now? What will be the most important bullet points about Fred Rogers?
Well, that is such an important question, and I hope that he is as fully remembered in 20 years as he is now. Of course, this being the 50th anniversary of the program going on national educational television,
right,
that's a reason for why a lot of what's taking place is taking place. I pegged my book to that anniversary. The wonderful documentary that was done about Fred's work, which is just a great piece of work, was pegged to that. So there's kind of a resurgence of interest right now. But to me, I think it's terribly important that people stay aware of what he represented. And I think to answer your question, there are two aspects to me that are terribly important about what he was and what he accomplished. The first is in the field of education, early education, of course, in which he really was a critical pioneer. He spent years working with the academics at the University of Pittsburgh, mm-hmm. starting back in the 1950s. And back in the 1950s, Pitt was the center of new thinking and research in early childhood. Not only was Dr. Margaret McFarland there, who was one of the leaders in the field and ran the Early Childhood Center at Pitt, but Dr. Barry Brazelton was there. Benjamin Spock was there. The great philosopher and writer Erik Erikson was there. They were all at Pitt, and they were all working on early childhood and child development questions. And Fred got dropped into the middle of that very fortuitously. Somebody from the seminary where he was getting his degree recommended to him that he talk to the people at Pitt, and he started studying there. So Fred dropped into the middle of that extraordinary environment, and he benefited from the thinking of these great academics. But he also benefited them because over the next 50 years, Fred, in my view, is the person who really taught America about the importance of early childhood education. So he brought this academic learning that might have been isolated in universities to a mass audience, to the general public. And, today, we all know how important early childhood education is. But if you go back to the 1950s and you said early childhood education, people thought you meant kindergarten.
Right.
They didn't even know that it was important at age 1, 2, and 3 for education to be taking place. So I think that's one critically important thing Fred did. And he did it because of his always setting the highest possible standards for the programming that he developed. But then the second part of my answer, which to me is almost more important, is I see him as this extraordinary, exemplary figure who focused so much on being a good person, on the right values, on human kindness, and he lived a life that was very, very intentional and deliberate and focused on being thoughtful, considerate, and kind to everybody that he met, everybody that he talked to, regardless of whether they were the president of PBS or a homeless person on the street. And I see that example for us, particularly today, as a huge, valuable legacy from Fred.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the things I really appreciated in that was brought out in the book is when Fred was actually in production on programs, given what the topic was on that particular program, he would actually, when he had a question right in the middle of production that he just wanted to get it just right, and making sure that how they were reaching children, he would actually stop production and jaunt over to Dr. McFarland's office at Pitt to raise the questions that he had about the right way of presenting something in his show, and then would come back and he would theoretically hold production up, and that's how particular he was.
Yes.
Yeah, I found that extremely interesting.
He was very much a perfectionist, although it's interesting that the staff people who worked with him never felt the sting of his being a perfectionist.
No.
They felt that he really listened to them and he gave them a chance to participate in shaping programs, so they didn't feel that he was an overbearing perfectionist.
Right.
But, that came out of his experience in the 1950s when he created a precursor to Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood called the Children's Corner.
That's right.
At WQED in Pittsburgh. And it was a delightful, zany program that was very, very popular and actually won some national awards. But Fred was frustrated with it because he knew that it was entertaining, he knew it was fun for children, and he also knew it wasn't really educational. And that was terribly frustrating for him. And Fred really brought that program to a halt before, it might easily have gone on for a number of years.
Yes.
But he brought it to a halt because he was anxious to move on to something that represented the highest level of excellence in terms of early childhood education. And so that along with his learning at the University of Pittsburgh gave him the capacity to deliver that kind of really excellent education.
I really also appreciate with his programs how he was able to mix his music, his art, his flair for art in his work and in the production in the show. And the thing that really amazes me about what he did was he at a point in his career made a very surprising decision to walk away from the show to make television for adults, only to return to produce The Neighborhood with increasingly more sophisticated episodes, taking on topics that are so timely today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the things that happened for Fred was after he'd produced The Neighborhood for about 7 years, he felt he had done what he needed to do in terms of children's programming. He also felt as if the episodes that he had produced would be evergreen, that they wouldn't be time-bound, and that they could be shown over and over and over. I don't think that's proven to be the case. I think their orientation to the time at which they were made does make them somewhat time-bound. But he turned to making television for adults, which never really got a lot of support from PBS or from funders. Never really took off in the way that he hoped it would. But during that period of time, thinking about the issues that he cared about and thinking about children, which he always, always cared so much about children, he began to realize that there was a way of coming back to the format of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, but doing so in a more bold and edgy way. And he started making theme weeks. So he would create an entire week on one theme, which is very complicated. It's 5 programs, and each program has both the neighborhood part and the neighborhood of make-believe part.
Right.
So it's a pretty complicated mechanism to put together. And then he did it on themes like death and violence and loss and divorce and all these really, really terribly difficult issues, not just for kids, but for anybody. And really, really made, particularly during the 1980s and the early 90s, some very, very sophisticated television. I was interested, I didn't watch every episode, but I watched maybe 100. And it was interesting to me how many of them, even though, I was watching them as an incipient old man, how many of them really spoke to me as a grown-up in a very powerful way.
That's the way I took those as well, because he knew especially when he was trying to also reach adults, and then he tried to do the more adult-oriented program, and then stepped away from that and went back to the neighborhood. But I think that experience allowed him to tackle these difficult subjects where he was not only appealing to children, but he was appealing to adults who would know then how to share and work with their children in talking about these difficult subjects. Well,
you're quite right that without that hiatus when he made programming for adults, he probably would not have been able to segue into the very sophisticated neighborhood programming of the 1980s. I think that's exactly right. And Fred, people think of him as being all about children, and of course he was speaking to children when he was on the neighborhood. But he was very, very focused on parents too, and very focused on the issue of parenting. And Fred often said and wrote that the ideal thing would be if the parent was watching with the child and he was speaking to both of them. And that's the way he approached the program, that he hoped that parents were watching and that he was speaking to parents. And he wrote a lot about parenting, and he cared a lot about parenting. And I think, now I'm speaking not so much for Fred as for myself right now, but as a funder who was involved in a lot of early childhood funding at 2 foundations, I became frustrated with what's happened with the early childhood system in the United States, in that it seems to me it focuses way too little on parenting and too much on creating institutional settings and putting kids in the institutional settings. Right. Not that there isn't great value there, and the kids get a lot out of it, but I think often the parents get left out of it, and that worries me. And I think it actually worried Fred, too.
His methods of reaching and teaching preschoolers on television was certainly groundbreaking. I consider that by educators, and much of it, I believe, has been incorporated into how we teach youngsters today. John, you would, I guess, agree with me on that.
Absolutely, yeah.
Did Fred realize that he was revolutionary and he was really breaking new ground?
I think he did, and I think what's really interesting is that he was breaking new ground in a way by being retro.
Yes.
And one of the characteristics of his program, and very deliberately so, is that he slowed everything way, way down. And, of course, television back in the 70s, what was happening to television? It was going faster and faster and faster, and the advertising techniques of shifting from one cut to another very quickly, creating almost staccato action, those were the techniques that were taking over commercial television. And Fred was going the opposite direction. He was going slower and slower. And there was even a contrast, I think, between what Fred was doing in Sesame Street early on. Sesame Street, as wonderful as it is, as spectacularly good programming as it is, early on was also adopted those advertising
Right.
techniques, and Sesame Street was very fast-paced, very quick cut, and also very focused on cognitive learning, while Fred was focused on social and emotional learning.
Right.
And so, but yes, I think Fred understood from his studies with Margaret McFarland and others at Pitt that what he was doing was groundbreaking. I think sometimes he was frustrated that the rest of the world and the television world didn't follow him, although, as you noted just a moment ago, today they are. There's a whole lot of programming on television today that's much more like Fred Rogers.
Absolutely. We're speaking with Maxwell King, who is the author of The Good Neighbor, the life and times of Fred Rogers, the children's television pioneer. Since not only in Fred's later days, but even since his passing, whenever there have been difficult things that have happened in our society and in our world today, as I remember as a young person growing up, the person that you always wanted to hear from was Walter Cronkite, who was that grandfatherly figure that would give you the news and give it to you straight, and the most trusting man in America. Well, Fred became that symbol for families and children, if you recall, and I thought it was really a remarkable piece that he did after 9/11.
Yeah.
That he really took that on himself. He no longer had the show, and he made that same. Can you tell us a little bit about how that all came about and what was his emphasis there?
Well, I think you're right that one of the reasons that people come back to him and his work when there's a crisis of some kind is that he made a series of programs after public events that he thought would be disturbing to children and to families, and he felt an obligation to say something about them. It started, I think, the first one was after Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated, and I think the last one was after 9/11, the one you just mentioned. And he made a series of those, and I think that's one of the reasons that people turn to him. I think the other reason is that people who know a little bit about him and his life know how deliberate and intentional he was about living out the most important values, the values, not just Christian values, but sort of universal humanistic values. And I think that's another reason why people come to him at times of crisis. I hope people will continue to come to him at times of crisis, but also just dig in a little bit into his life, whether it's through the documentary or the book or his own speeches and writings about life in general, not just during a crisis, because I think he has so much to teach everybody.
Yeah. Our time is up. Maxwell King, such a fantastic interview and great book, The Good Neighbor, The Life and Work of Fred Rogers. Best of luck to you in your retirement, and for those who haven't read it, go out and purchase it. It's a fantastic read. Thanks so much for being with us.
Oh, thank you. What a great conversation. I appreciate it.
And that's our program for today. We'll be back in 2 weeks at this same time. In the meantime, you can go online to learn more at papromiseforchildren.com. For John Posa and the Early Learning Resource Center, I'm Joe Taylor. Thank you for listening, and have a great day.